Cool. So live coding brainstorm session. I think the plan here is twofold. I think one is I've talked to each of you, I would say not at length, about live coding and sort of doing something or not doing something, or what would we even do. I think James has brought up an interesting point of like, was it a solution proposed in search of a problem, or was it something else? Oh, you're turned off your back. Got it. And so like trying to figure that out. James and I spoke a little, which is where like the problems to validate came from. Also in there, as I talked with a developer advocate who works for a company that has utilizes live sharing a lot, and got his take on it and what it is. I think there were some interesting things that came out of that in terms of technical problems that have to be solved. But I think part of this is like, I don't know, there's some problems to validate, so maybe we do some problem validation things. I think the other is maybe we think about like other use cases or other implementations that would satisfy live coding. Maybe we think, and maybe the problem validation gets to the point where we decide like, maybe it's a problem, but we don't want to solve it.
What were some of the salient points out of your conversation with the dev advocate at Microsoft?
I would say the biggest ones were that they used it because it was easy. Many people there use VS Code for obvious reasons, and so like it's there and it's easy. Lots of the stuff that they did.
When you
was
say
not,
it, you're referring to the live
VS
sharing?
Code's live share. Yeah,
okay.
live share that's in VS Code. I would say that, you know, his primary use case was largely around like prototyping or working on something, maybe a project or something else, that like throwing together 5 or 6 files to get a working demo for something that they might need to show off or do, and being able to have someone else work on that with you was a good way to do that. They also don't use Google Docs for obvious reasons, and so sometimes they would collaborate on documentation inside of VS Code, much like we could do like if 2 people wanted to work on the same handbook page at the same time or something like that. That could be a potential use case. The other interesting thing, and where I think we get into a questionable technical challenge, is the voice channel is a highly important part of this experience, meaning that like, great, we're all on the same editor and we can manipulate files, but we're 99.9% of the time also talking to each other in real time with voice. And so to me, that's where that gets interesting in terms of like being a hard problem to solve. We've either got a layer on top of an existing, some kind of voice service, or we integrate with a bunch of stuff. If that is truly like an important part for most people, which I think it likely is. They did say they've used chat a few times, but they were more likely to pick up the phone if like they didn't have another voice channel running.
I guess we already have this problem if you were to take the Google Docs scenario right now. We're talking on Zoom, voice channel on Zoom, live document in Google Docs. So to your point, yes, the voice is critical, but is it such a problem to rely on some third-party service for voice and video, at least for for like a significant period of time, given many organizations use Zoom side by side with Google Docs or Skype side by side with Google Docs for many years without trouble?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think my counter question to that is like, why wouldn't I just share my screen in the Zoom meeting? I know we do this for Google Docs where like people are talking And then sometimes people are taking notes, or people are putting other things in there, or outcomes or other things. I think the experience when you're coding is potentially different, right? In that you might be typing and someone might be like talking to you about what you're typing, but you may not like, I don't know that thread crosses as much, I guess, right? Like if we were to have like a file open that we were editing in like a project, I feel like it would be like, oh, I'm trying to get these two lines to work. And you might be looking at it and being like, oh, well, you need to pass XYZ in, but I don't think you're typing maybe while I'm doing that. Like it feels to me like a Zoom meeting could cover off like 90% of your want. Like what you don't get out of a Zoom meeting is like someone else interacting with your screen. But I'm not sure if
that's true.
I don't know either.
So we used to do like, well, we still do with GitLab, but like with Geo, we used to do live demos. With the Web idea, we did live demos while we were working on it, to sort of like every week we'd have a demo to sort of check in on progress. And a lot of the time you'd end up like, you'd be running it on the GDK or on a server, and then you'd have to like switch into a console or switch into like some code to debug something. And my experience of that is that with Zoom, it's really difficult because like we would often spend a bunch of time like messing around to make the editor the right size so everyone could read the text. It's like, oh, your screen's massive, but I'm on a laptop and I can't read anything. Or like the contrast is kind of funky because you've got some weird low contrast dark theme and I'm colorblind, and I can't read that. But also like, I think the biggest issue with screen sharing in these stuff is it's sometimes exceedingly disorienting to watch someone doing development, because they have a perfect mental model of their IDE, which is probably different to mine. And they're just tabbing around, scrolling around at the speed of light, trying to debug something. Meanwhile, I just want to read the config that they've just changed, or just look at the file or the function that's not working while they're scouring around for something else. Like, particularly with development, I think like the power of having multiple people working together is not that you're looking at the same thing, like physically the same screen, but you're looking at the same problem. And so you, like, frequently, to go back to a Google Docs analogy, someone will mention something and like they'll be screen sharing their presentation, but I'll have a Google Doc open or the same thing open and I'll be like 5 slides ahead or 3 slides back because I didn't understand something and I'm trying to catch up. And that to me is the massive downside of screen share, is that you're fixed in this one view and you can't escape.
I'll tell you that, I mean, right now I've got Google Docs open as you're typing and I'm watching you type, and the same effect could be achieved if you were literally sharing your screen right now. But I will tell you, there is something innate in that watching you type, while I have access to go around the doc and zoom around the doc or even just jot my own thing real quick versus watching you type. I would 100% agree with James on this. And even in one-on-ones, like I just got out of a one-on-one with someone else who shared their one-on-one doc with me in Zoom as they were walking through it. And I actually had their one-on-one doc open to the side just so that I could have a little bit more control. And so I had 2 instances of that going, which probably isn't ideal, but yeah, I want to echo James's point. So I think there's something here that screen sharing can't solve for.
Yeah.
And
so
I think I also want to say one thing too, which is like sometimes screen sharing can give you control. So for example, like I think I can request control of your computer via Zoom.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I've certainly used that in other products.
But
like
it's laggy. The latency is bad.
Yeah.
It also just puts that problem we were just talking about back onto the person that was originally projecting their screen. And so, you know, it seems pretty binary because you don't want people fighting the mouse and that kind of stuff. So I think 2 people with independent access and degrees of freedom makes sense while looking at the same thing. Did we lose Kai? I think we lost Kai.
I suspect a child had to.
So
Fucking dog.
That's a dog.
we solved all the
mean,
problems while you were gone.
Awesome.
I feel like when I've spoken about this previously, when I've thought about this previously, like there's certainly something here, like some sort of live collaboration thing where you can work on some sort of document, maybe some code, and live collaborate. I think most people feel like it feels obvious that there's a use case there. I think the problem which I hit, and I think Kai is hitting, and it is like there are lots of different problems that benefit from this solution. Like there is the problem of like having a meeting and having an agenda. There is the problem of collaborating on like a blog post. There is the problem of code review. There is the problem of extreme programming and like pair programming. All of those have like different expectations and different personas. And there are like each one of them, like depending on which problem you focus on, leads to a different sort of natural like solution, like where you'd want it to be. Like, I don't know, like we could take these notes in an IDE, right? But that would not be, I think, if we're thinking about the kind of personas we want to like have using GitLab and like even just internally at GitLab, like dog fooding, right? Like if we were like, oh, well, let's build it with the persona of like taking meeting notes. So one-on-ones and marketing meetings and product meetings and the group conversation can happen inside of GitLab, right? The web IDE probably wouldn't be the vehicle because like imagine the chaos of like every single GitLabber inside the company call agenda in the web IDE. Like more than half the company is not a developer and the web IDE is like really, it's like an IDE tool. Like it's not, it doesn't support any of the formatting options anyone's familiar with. Like it doesn't look like a document, it looks like a piece of code. So like if you're solving that persona, that problem, like you end up being like, oh, well, the web IDE is not the vehicle for it. If you're like, oh, well, we have to solve a coding problem of code review or pair programming, Kai was like, well, pair programming involves like active development, and like the web IDE, we've just updated the vision to say like, we're not trying to be a replacement for the local development environment. So like,
yeah,
we got to like work out which problem we're trying to solve before we can be like, well, what's the MVC to solve that problem?
So we've scoped the conversation to live coding. So I guess I was never thinking that this was the group conversation or Google Docs replacement type brainstorm. Mm-hmm. And you've also provided some nice thoughts on real-time merge requests and merge request descriptions in your YouTube video. So I was kind of leaving that to the side for now and thinking about, okay, we're saying live coding. Okay, coding is a task that a developer does. How do they do that in GitLab? They do it in the web IDE. We've also updated the category direction to say that the web IDE is for secondary engineering efforts. It's not for primary engineering efforts. So for what secondary engineering efforts would live coding be valuable for? And I understand by even asking that we're backing into the problem, but I think because there's just a broad surface space here of what problems we could tackle, it's probably good to just scope it down to live coding, web IDE, secondary engineering efforts. Where do we go with those as the constraints?
I mean, I think that forces you into like a code review area. If that's like, to me, that would be like the logical area would be two people could open like the same merge request at the same time in the web IDE. like the same set of diffs, which you could do today. There's nothing preventing that from happening. You just don't share the context, I think, or you don't share like the real-time context of that. Although there's no reason you both couldn't open the web IDE at the same time and then hop on a Zoom call, which is really all we said earlier. I just wouldn't be able to see your cursor.
Yeah.
Although what would happen if you both tried to commit at the same time? Web IDE would probably throw a fit, but
I'm almost certain it would throw a fit based off of my own experience there.
You'd have a
we
race
fixed a lot of
condition.
the upstream like stuff, but like if you opened it in the context of like a fixed upstream point,
you should end up with one commit succeeding, the other failing, and the failed commit then has to go into a different branch. So you'd have to take a branch off.
That's what'll happen.
I think we probably, well.
No, the APIs, because it just uses the same commit API. So one of them will succeed and one should fail.
Yeah, that's true. But it won't fail gracefully. It'll just tell you that something's changed and you can't do
it does not fail gracefully. You can't do anything about it. It basically just says like, oh, branch has changed. Sorry, you're out of luck.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like that would be like, if we scope it all the way down to secondary engineering efforts, I think that's an area that would make sense. I think, I mean, James had an interesting point earlier about dog fooding, which is true. Like we have very clearly at GitLab, when we have dog fooded something that has become significantly better than things that we don't use on a regular basis. Search being like, since I spend a lot of my time in search land, a very great example of how when we didn't use it for 2 years, but it existed in the product, we didn't know how bad it was. And then we started using it and we're like, oh, it's pretty terrible. This feels like one of those things that, given how many of like GitLab's own MRs are reviewed like async and off hours, like we're not going to get people necessarily doing that.
So sync is a constraint of live coding. I would agree. I thought that there was a concerted effort though to align reviewers with time zones. And what I would say is a challenge for us right now is code review is taking just a long time in general. And so could this be a potential solution? So maybe there's a problem right there. Code review takes a long time. Could this be a potential solution to help live up to our efficiency value of getting on a live sharing session with someone in the web IDE and reviewing that with a maintainer? Because right now, I believe the code review process just goes through the diff and they make comments. And
yeah, I think
in the case
most people, well, the maintainers in our group that I talk to, they all check out locally to do code review.
And then how are they getting their comments back onto the MR?
That's the other half of their monitor is the MR, where they go line by line and leave comments, but it has to do with wanting to browse the entirety of like the code base at that point in time versus like just browsing the diff.
Which you could theoretically do in the web IDE.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we want to bring code review into the web IDE.
Yeah, and this is like quickly cutting to one of the challenges at the moment is like code review is also getting similar feedback and enhancing the code review interface so that you can open arbitrary files, that you can jump around using code intelligence. And so I guess it's interesting to try, like, I guess from one perspective, it's like, this is great. GitLab's trying to disrupt itself and like pioneer a new model that's like in the web IDE. But on the other hand, it's like, well, we're like seeing the same feedback and we're trying to solve the same problem twice in two different ways. So it's like duplication of effort. And so depending on the perspective of the observer, it's either a great thing or like a massive inefficiency.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, and I don't know that putting code review in the web IDE like solves code reviews problems, because we still run into like most of our maintainers actually run everybody's branch in the GDK, especially front-end maintainers, because it's hard to tell what actually happened unless you run that branch.
Review apps are meant to be the alternative to that. So in theory, we've got like strategies for addressing both those problems. Like review apps are meant to allow you to run the app, see the change. Like you come to the code review and you can click on it and test it. And secondarily, like we've also like the merge request is also like improving to provide greater access through the file tree, commenting on arbitrary lines, commenting on arbitrary files, as well as like code intelligence. So in theory, like there are two prongs on like features that have high levels of usage. Merge request, which has like 90% usage by existing customers. Like we're listening to those 90% of customers and improving that. And CI, I mean, review apps has like much lower usage, but CI has higher adoption than the web IDE.
Yeah, for sure.
This is not arguments that we should not be like trying to solve this problem through the web IDE, because there's people who will still prefer to have an IDE to do this kind of work.
So we've got 3 minutes left. Oh no, does this go till 5?
I think it goes till 5 because I wanted
It goes to 5.
I wanted the 50 minutes, but couldn't start till 4:15 or something.
I gotcha. Okay, cool. I take back my comment then.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like it sounds like it's worth. I mean, it sounds like there's at least several problems. I guess, Eric, you seem to think we should scope it to like what we think the web IDE is, which is like secondary coding efforts or secondary engineering efforts, as we termed them.
I just don't think you should do something outside of what a category direction states that you are doing for the web IDE. Like you've clearly made a persona decision and you're targeting the things that you're doing and the features that you're building there against that persona. I'm not saying like it should be that way forever and ever. Like potentially, I would love for there to be an experience inside of GitLab where we replace all engineering efforts, and I think we're seeing some of our customers have asked us for that, right? So where they can have like a an environment that they just give to their employees on day one, and it's standard across the entire development staff. So even though I think we say that what the web IDE is going to be used for secondary engineering efforts, I think it will be used for primary engineering efforts in some circumstances. And so maybe it's not a primary persona, but I think it's a persona that's going to use it by just nature of the feature being there. And so in that case, I think there is a little bit of value in having some sort of live sharing, live coding option. It seems like maybe the right place to start is just to get the thing to be more real time. Like if you open the web IDE on a branch and someone else opens the web IDE on the branch, like it feels like you should know that, see the same thing. Seems like we shouldn't block commits against the branch for multiple people at the same time. It could be a place to start. I don't know. I'm curious. You spend a lot more time thinking about the web IDE than I have. I've consistently said I think it's one of our coolest features.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this category existing at all, only because like if I were to think about like engineering efforts inside of like maximal value for like pioneering this technology, right, that we're going to have to go figure out how to do to get two people to show up on the same page at the same time, or like their changes to show up in real time. Like if we start adding in like the Google Docs, like I type and you see what I type at the same time, like I'm not sure the IDE is the place that like I would do that first in all of GitLab. And so it feels which is like the bigger conversation of like, should it be wikis or should it be issues or should it be something else? Like if we're going to go spend the time learning operational transformation or whatever else we're going to use to do this, like, should we lock this up in the editor?
Yeah. And to that point, I did do a fair bit of investigation into like what a technical MVC might look like. When I was trying to work out like, is there a way to do this? What could be the way to achieve this? And one of the things that I quickly discovered is that doing operational transformation for source code, like plain text, is technically very different from doing operational transformation to something like a rendered markdown document that looks like Google Docs or like an issue. Like it wouldn't be possible, like you wouldn't do operational transformation on the underlying markdown in a WYSIWYG interface that's like generating markdown, right? Because there's like too many layers of indirection, like separation between like what the user's seeing and like the underlying representation. Like you've got like conversion layers to the underlying thing, then you've got conversion layer to operational transformation. You've got that on both sides. And you need to also store this on a server so that if someone gets disconnected, like data doesn't get lost. Because I was looking at it like, if the Web IDE pioneered this, could we backport it to anywhere else? Like, because I didn't want to build something that was going to be useful only in the Web IDE. Like, this is going to be a big engineering effort, and we don't want to be building like real-time Google Docs style collaboration in one place and then realize like, this is going to be completely useless for like making issues real time, for making comments real time, for making any other kind of part of GitLab real time, like wikis. Like imagine a real time wiki that we could compete with Confluence with. Like all the user personas of that will need a WYSIWYG style editor. And if what we would build on the Web IDE was not going to help us with that goal, that was to me a really big concern, because that's like huge amounts of wasted engineering effort and then dual maintenance of like highly similar features. And so that was kind of where the work stopped from my perspective. Was like, I didn't know how to move forward in this in a way that I thought would actually provide like long-term value. And there were no MVCs that I could see that were small, like that didn't require like months and months and months of engineering to build something of like limited value. Like it has value in terms of achieving some direction category goal of like having something in that category, but like there didn't seem to be a clear use case that there was demand for that, when there was like much clearer demand for like similar solutions. I don't know, that's sort of like going back to this argument of like, well, what about this other category? But I mean, I guess I remember when this category was added to like create, and it was kind of added, I feel, well, it was added when we looked at the thing. It was like, there are no new categories in create. Like, what should we do? And Mark was like, oh, we need to have something in real time. Like real time's really important. I was like, oh yes, I agree. Real time's important. He's like, let's do live coding. And it was like, then it was added. And like, that was like the history of how this category like popped into being, not based on like a clear strategic analysis of like, what is the best place to add real-time capabilities? Like, is this going to grow the adoption of the Web IDE? Like, they weren't the questions that precipitated this. They were like, we need real-time somewhere. We need something new and create. How about this? Because Microsoft just released live share.
I mean, I think we've seen that though. Like the dev section continued to get, like even this year when it got rewritten, like we continued to have to like add in a bullet about real time. Like it was still something that like important, and we didn't tie that to live coding. Like we just kind of casually dropped real time into dev.
Well, it was really targeted at a lot of the boards and plan use cases, and then around some of the ideas that James had around merge requests. I think the context is important. I think the history is important. I don't know how much of a penalty we pay for having two different types of OT implementations. It's likely a lot, but I don't know. But you could also make the same argument for having an IDE in the first place. Like, why do we even do that? Why are we maintaining this thing? So I don't know if that's a reason to not do something. It's a consideration.
I just wanted to put it out on the table because I think
it's
Kai was sort of mentioning things that sort of alluded to it, and I wanted to just be explicit about the history of this. And like,
I don't think that like real time is something that one group necessarily owns and then rolls out to the whole. Like I'd be happy if every PM took some aspect of real time into their own product. Now we shouldn't all solve for it in different ways. That would be silly. But if there was an aspect of real time experience to the Web IDE as well as code review within an MR, I don't know if that's actually a problem.
The category is prescriptive in solution at the moment. Live coding is very prescriptive, which like forces a very specific kind of like solution.
So the other part about that too, sorry to jump in, but it is a separate category than the Web IDE. So theoretically, from an organizational perspective, it doesn't have to necessarily be tied to the Web IDE, much like other categories aren't necessarily predicated on others. So maybe that statement I made at the beginning of the call, maybe it was too limiting. But if we don't have the Web IDE, I guess I'm struggling at what foundation do we even use to do this anyway. So,
I mean, it's not tied to the Web IDE, but it's tied to the editor group, which maintains.
It's tied to your group, sure.
One single editing experience inside of GitLab based on
version of LiveShare that works with both VS Code, Vim, and Emacs. That runs on the GitLab server so that you don't need to like use Microsoft technology.
Hard pass on your Vim and Emacs plugins.
No, but essentially the actual serious part of that joke was like when we were discussing the other day about LiveShare with VS Code, it is heavily Microsoft. Like,
yep.
If you want to use, you can use VS Code without being in the Microsoft land, really. But if you want to do LiveShare, essentially, like all this information is going through the Microsoft servers, right? Essentially.
Yes.
Right. You need a Microsoft account to like connect to each other.
Yep.
Like I can imagine some organizations who are like, oh, we don't use Microsoft because of some competitive or security reason or something like that. They might want to actively block and prohibit that kind of feature purely because of the Microsoft elements. Like if there was an open source alternative that somehow like connected through the GitLab servers and GitLab enabled that feature and somehow like brought some GitLab source, like maybe this is part of like the GitLab VS Code extension roadmap is like an alternative to Microsoft LiveShare, which is like the GitLab server powered LiveShare so that you can collaborate with people directly in your editor. I mean, that may just be equally hard to build, but maybe that's a more useful feature than LiveShare in the Web IDE, is LiveShare in the local editor powered by the GitLab server.
I know we're like nearly up against time. Does Gitter, someone who knows nothing about Gitter, does Gitter have any of that like back end in place? Like a
OT or voice channels?
I mean, like accounts in chat and central servers running. Like, does Gitter run like in a centralized way, or?
Gitter is it's like a central server, like gitter.im. It's not something that comes with an omnibus installation. So you wouldn't be able to use Gitter chat for like a text chat feature easily.
Well, if you like connected to Gitter, right? Like if you built like a separate
Yeah,
Gitter
but
chat client, like
then
inside
it
of
wouldn't
another.
work like in a private network. Like if you're talking like some federal agency or
Sure.
conservative financial institution,
Yeah.
it wouldn't work in that context.
Right.
Which are probably the customers that are more likely to want to forego like Microsoft having stuff flowing through their servers. That's just like one crazy idea of taking this in a totally different direction that bypasses the web IDE.
So that's interesting, but you could also use that same rationale as like a reason to essentially put this into the web IDE too. Because I would never screen share using Microsoft stuff, but hey, let's just hop on a screen share for this one specific targeted thing in the code. And I'm not writing thousands of lines of code right now, but I do want to share this with you. We can work through this.
One interesting thing about starting with VS Code locally is you get a much more mature, robust editor out the door.
Yep.
And we've already explored, and it is possible that if we wanted to bring this into like the web IDE, we could switch to Thea or upgrade to like VS Code in the browser versus like Monaco in the browser. So in theory, like starting with a local IDE, like presuming we've like got a willingness to like really level up the web IDE with something like Thea in the future.
Right.
I know that now we've said no.
Yeah, we've said no to that for this year. It's also a reason that we put live coding kind of on hold at the end of middle of to later part of last year as well, because switching to something like Thea would have given us a better foundation for this. But I think what I'm trying to do is maybe push the boundary of a secondary engineering effort, where like someone does primary development in VS Code, commits that to a branch, and says to someone across the world, "Hey, can you quickly take a look at this with me?" It's not like a formal code review, but it's something where they're trying to attempt to look at something together and they're not co-located. Just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, it could be possible to like broadcast cursor positions, probably relatively straightforward. I think like there's things like just broadcasting cursor positions in files, like which file someone's looking at, which maybe bypass like and allow us to say like we've done something without doing full OT. The advantage with starting with something like just, is someone looking at this branch? Which file are they looking at? You'll probably actually uncover a lot of problems early on, because having looked at it briefly for the real-time merge request stuff, like running like a million sockets at the same time is not something that the infrastructure team is particularly enthusiastic about, but is something that we will have to solve.
That's Plan's problem right now, right? Like they're having socket issue, like they're trying to build all the socket backend.
Yeah, we are trying to get one field on the sidebar in an issue to be updated in real time. Like that's kind of our MVC.
Without doing polling.
Exactly.
Oh, maybe Plan will solve that for you then, Kai.
Do you know how close they are, Eric?
I don't. It was announced in the 12.8 kickoff call, so I have to check. The other thing too, though, is like going back to what James was saying, where he took it in like a different direction. Is, are there other? And we're out of time, so we'll have to do this offline or async or in a separate conversation. But are there other things that we're not thinking about? Is there something where you would want someone to live stream GitLab like as a whole, not just limited to coding? Is it more about sharing? Is it more about collaboration, where we originally were talking about, right? Where maybe it's less about coding and it's more about collaborating in an issue or in a wiki or something. Those would be other ideas.
What if it was aligned with the merge request real-time stuff? And so like, if you're looking at a branch inside of the IDE that is on a merge request, like it shows a status indicator on the merge request. so it calls you into the web IDE, so you can like know someone's looking at it. Yeah, maybe there's a whole lot of real-time stuff that could just be not live coding, but like all the stuff that isn't coding. Like, I don't know if that's useful, but I mean, it's also a problem because like the category is called coding, right?
I mean, there's code in the general area where other things are live. Just take the context however you want.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at time, so I need to drop. But
yep. Thanks everyone for the time and the conversation. I'll continue to think on this and see if maybe we can spend some engineering effort trying to figure out what it would take to maybe.
Do we need to do problem validation for this? Like, I think if we were like have a hunch for like what the problem is worth solving, I think it's worth going through the problem validation cycle and saying like, is this even a problem? And even if the score is like index is low on that, like our confidence in the problem, like at least getting people to buy in and be like, we're still going to do this MVC to solve this problem, even though the confidence is low, because just because the category exists, like, there's still worth going through this whole process.
I agree. I think it's totally worth going through it and getting, I think that'll just open up a ton more user feedback, and then I think a ton more up the chain feedback of people who are going to have to rationalize this on engineering time at some point.
Yeah.
So. Okay.
Cool.
Have a good night.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.